Hi, everybody. I'm Anna Harvey, President of the Social Science Research Council, and welcome to the Council's 8th Centennial Lecture of 2023. We're hosting 10 Centennial Lectures this year to celebrate the founding of the Social Science Research Council 100 years ago, as well as the achievements of the social and behavioral sciences over the last 100 years. Our Centennial Lectures feature faculty from the institutions in our college and university fund for the social sciences, and each lecture is focused on one of 10 important policy issues that represent each decade of the last 100 years of the Council's work. Our prior Centennial Lectures focused on important research topics for the Council in the 1920s through the 1980s, including immigration, social insurance, racial discrimination, economic development, the Green Revolution, education, and persistent poverty. You can find recordings of all these lectures on our Centennial Lectures website. This month, we're featuring the work of social and behavioral scientists who are identifying effective strategies to address climate change, which was a research topic central to the Council's work in the 1990s. In that decade, the Council established a research committee on global environmental change to study, and I quote, the long-term, large-scale interfaces of humanity, technology, and the global environment. The committee sponsored nearly 24 conferences and produced numerous reports. And recently, we've rededicated the Council's resources to supporting work that seeks to identify interventions that move attitudes and behaviors in the direction of reducing emissions. In a recent event we hosted at the Rockefeller Foundation, we heard from researchers who have created emissions markets that have reduced industrial plant emissions, work with smart thermostat companies to encourage consumers' use of automation, which reduces electricity consumption, and worked with an airline company to reduce pilots' unnecessary use of fuel. And today, we're very fortunate to be joined by Kelsey Jack from the University of California at Santa Barbara, who is going to tell us about her work to build an evidence base for climate interventions in low and middle income countries. Feel free to post questions in the Q&A as Kelsey is talking, and I'll field them to her after she winds up. We have about an hour, and we'll try to save about 15 minutes of that hour for Q&A at the end. So Kelsey, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, Anna. Let's see, I'm trying to share my video. I don't know if you want it on or not.
Yeah, I think having video on is probably great.
Good. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to share my screen and tell you a little bit about some of the progress that I think is being made on this topic. You can see in the title, which is building an evidence base for climate interventions in low and middle income countries. And I want to start by really kind of setting the stage of the gap between the extreme need for evidence and or the extreme need for solutions and where financing is at to address these problems. So many of you have probably seen maps like this one of per capita emissions. You can see very clearly from this that the rich countries in the world are the ones with the highest per capita emissions. The low income countries are still well behind. But in some ways, hopefully, with economic development in these places, emissions will continue to rise. And so what this means is that we really kind of desperately need innovative solutions that can cost effectively mitigate greenhouse gas emissions by reducing it in the places that it's already high and preventing it from increasing in the places where it's still low, but without stymieing economic growth. But if we look at financial flows, if we look at kind of annual financing, there are less than $600 billion that are going into this each year. And if you, like I, have a hard time figuring out how big of a number is 600 billion, you can compare this to the amount that Americans spend eating out each year, which is about twice the annual financing flows. Now, if you shift over to climate adaptation, one thing you can notice is that the map kind of flips here, where now we see the places with the lowest per capita emissions on the previous slide are the places with the highest projected mortality costs. So in other words, the costs of climate change are really going to hit low-income countries the hardest. So again, the need for investment, the need for solutions here is immense. Adaptation, things like you can, to give a concrete example, you can think about, for example, heat-resistant crops could help reduce some of these costs in the places where people are most vulnerable. And yet financing here is even lower. It's about $46 billion a year. And again, for comparison, Americans spend about that much on entertainment each year. Now, the point of these facts is not to complain about how Americans spend their money, nor is it to make a normative point about who should be financing climate mitigation or adaptation, but rather to just highlight that in this circumstance where the need is tremendous and the financing potentially falls quite short, that making sure the way that what money is spent effectively, meaning that the spending actually has impacts, is extremely important. And yet too often, the climate finance that does flows in a relatively evidence-free space, that there's not a backing of sort of clear evidence that spending on this project or that project is actually having an impact, nor is there sort of an interrogation of, if we did it differently, could it achieve that same impact but at a lower cost? So we might contrast this with how the private sector thinks about investments. Firms often use A/B testing, for example, to trial new products to make sure that before something new goes to market, they can be sure that it's going to be profitable, and also that the design features, for example, are selected so that it's going to really maximize their profits. And we should be, thinking similarly in the climate space about trying to test and innovate before we scale things up, to really make sure that the money that we're spending is actually effective. And so what I want to do today is give you a couple of examples of taking this kind of approach of A/B testing out of the private sector and moving it into social sciences, but in sort of real projects, and in particular in the climate space. So I'll give you one example in climate mitigation, in policies to address emission sources in India, and a second one applied to adaptation. I'm thinking about vulnerable farmers in the Sahel. Both of these examples are applied to the agriculture sector. I would argue this is actually a very important sector to be thinking about when we're thinking about climate change. It's a particularly exposed one in terms of the impacts of climate change, but it's also a major emission source. So globally, you can find different estimates, but something in the ballpark of a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions are from the agriculture sector. In many low and middle income countries, it's a higher share, and around a quarter of the world's population depends on agriculture for its livelihoods. Again, in low and middle income countries, this is a much larger share. So this is an important area to be generating evidence. It also happens to be the area where I work. So I'm gonna tell you about a couple of projects in this space. I'm gonna dive right in. So the first mitigation example comes from a project with several co-authors. And what we're interested in understanding is policy interventions that can help reduce crop residue burning in India. So what is crop residue burning, you ask? This is a very common practice in a lot of agricultural settings around the world, and particularly in Asia, and particularly in South Asia, where farmers, after they harvest their fields, they're left with crop stubble or crop residue left behind after harvest. And the cheapest and fastest way to clear that stubble, to make way for planting a new crop, is to set it on fire. So fire is an ancient technology. It's one humans have used very effectively for a very long time. And estimates say that over 5 million acres are burned each year in India, contributing to over 80,000 premature deaths annually, largely from the local pollutants that get emitted when the particulate matter is produced off of this burning, but also contributing a significant portion of CO2 emissions at the same time. Now, from the farmer's perspective, as I said, clearing is sort of the fastest and cheapest thing available, saving time and money. And most of these damages, these local air pollution costs and CO2 emissions, climate costs, are felt by others. So in particular, through health effects that accrue to people in other states in India, but also globally via climate change. Now, past interventions that the government has done in India have been largely ineffective. These have included fines. In 2015, crop residue burning was banned. Equipment subsidies, the government has spent a very large amount of money subsidizing particular pieces of machinery that farmers could use instead of setting their fields on fire. But if you look at the figure on this slide, this is a count of fires in the area of this study over time. You can see there's this just very continuous increase over time, even across the years when these policy changes are taking place. So these approaches have been largely ineffective. What we wanted to consider is an alternative, that rather than prohibiting fires, fining them, which has political challenges, what about creating incentives, compensating farmers if they don't actually burn their fields, and instead do something that is more environmentally friendly, but potentially more privately costly? So you may have heard of a payments for ecosystem services type of an approach. This is taking that idea and applying it to crop residue burning. This has the advantage of potentially being more politically feasible than fines, and also more flexible than subsidizing specific pieces of machinery. If farmers want to find other approaches to avoiding burning and still get the subsidy, still get this compensation, they can. Now, the design challenge, and really where we wanted to test to see how we could innovate here, was how to make these kinds of incentives effective and relevant for this study context. So we asked, how do we best design these payments for ecosystem services contracts in this case? The standard model that's used around the world, a lot of it's applied to reducing deforestation in other countries. Taking this idea to the crop residue burning context, the standard contracting approach would make a payment conditional on verification that a farmer has not burned his field. And I say his because most of the farmers are men in this context. Now, the challenge with that is if the farmer doesn't trust that that payment is actually going to be made after he makes his costly change in practices, or if the farmer lacks some of the cash on hand that he needs in order to adopt some alternative to burning at the time before the payment actually pays out, then that might really reduce compliance. What we wanted to test then is, are there ways to adapt this policy mechanism to actually increase its effectiveness? So what we thought is that, well, making some of the payment upfront and unconditionally might help address this. So what does this do? Making some of the payment upfront increases the trust that any payment that's conditional on compliance, that's conditional on not burning the field, is actually going to come. Why would somebody who's offering a contract pay a little bit upfront if they're not going to also pay conditional on avoiding burning? But it also means that the farmer has some cash at the time that he needs to adopt some alternative. At the same time, there's a potential trade-off. If you're paying, $1 upfront, that's perhaps $1 less to pay conditional on complying with the contract. And it also may be that a lot of these payments that are not conditioned on the desired behavior goes to farmers who end up burning in the end after all. So this raises questions about, is this actually going to be a more effective approach? And in addition, what are the cost implications? Is it also a more cost-effective approach? And so the kind of A/B testing idea that we then took on to try to figure out if this was actually a good direction to move in was to do a randomized controlled trial where we took villages and assigned them to different treatments. So some villages get assigned to a status quo control group where kind of business as usual, nothing has changed relative to their usual situation. Some were assigned to the standard PES contract, where all of the payment is conditional on verification that the farmer did not actually burn his field. And the third group was assigned to this payments for ecosystem services with some portion of that payment made upfront. So we can compare the control group, where no intervention has taken place, with either of these two treatment groups to get a sense of impact. Do these actually move the needle? Do these actually change behavior? And because villages were randomly assigned to one of these groups, we can assume that, but for this intervention, we should expect that burning rates would be relatively similar across these different groups. Now you can see at the bottom, this is sort of the full experimental design. We have some additional things going on with payment levels and other things like that. happy to talk in the Q&A more about those. I just want to give you the high level picture of what the design was and how we use this testing, both to see, can this sort of rewards or incentive-based approach actually work, one, and can we innovate on the design to improve its effectiveness and to improve its cost effectiveness. We combined this study design with satellite data on crop burning, and that's our main outcome that we're interested in. So what I'm showing you here is first comparing the standard payments for ecosystem services approach to the upfront payments for ecosystem services approach. What did contract compliance look like? Notice that the control group isn't in here because they weren't offered contracts. So in some ways, compliance is zero by construction. So this is the administrative data picture. If we just look at the comparison between how many of the farmers who got this upfront payment complied with the contract, meaning that we verified that they did not in fact burn their fields, versus the standard PES arm, we see that there's about a 10 percentage point increase in the probability of compliance, right? So this is going to be the probability that they didn't actually burn their fields. This, however, masks an important detail if we actually look at the satellite data on whether a farmer did not burn. So I've changed this so a 1 in this figure is not burning, so that it's comparable to the compliance. What you see from this is that first, comparing the gray bar, which is the control group, almost 10% of farmers in the control group are not burning their fields anyway. So even in the absence of this intervention, we're not seeing burning happening there. And coming in and making these conditional payments on top of that, the standard PES arm actually doesn't really change burning behavior. So we don't see a significant difference between the control group and the standard PES arm. This upfront payment, on the other hand, increases the probability that a farmer did not burn, so the environmentally desirable activity, by about 8 percentage points, much closer to what we see just in the administrative data. If we just relied on the administrative data, we have sort of missed the fact that the standard PES contracts are actually not changing behavior. It's really only this treatment arm where some of the payment is provided upfront to farmers that seems to work. So this is a suggestion indeed that mistrust and liquidity are barriers to the standard PES contracts actually working in this context, and a new and innovative contract design is really necessary to change behavior. Now, one thing you also may be thinking, looking at this, is, well, great, you increased the rate of not burning or decreased the rate of burning in this, but there's still a lot of farmers who are burning their fields. That's certainly true, but what we can also show is do some kind of cost-benefit calculations to show that, in fact, this standard PES approach is also very cost-effective and produces benefits far in excess of its cost. There are a bunch of assumptions in the numbers that I'm going to talk through right now, so you're welcome to, I'll post at the end a place where you can see the full paper if you're interested in seeing a bit more of this. But first, just on the cost per acre of avoided burning, for that, we can just take the amount that farmers were paid and divide it by the treatment effect that we measure, the difference between the upfront PES arm and the control group. And there we see that it costs about $54 to reduce burning on 1 acre of land. Now, that may seem like a lot of money, but when you compare it with the benefits, which are the lower numbers on the slide, what you can see is that a kind of back of the envelope calculation of the mortality benefits from reduced burning. These are relying on numbers that come from the literature, not numbers from our paper, because they require things like estimates of the amount of particulate being emitted and other things like that. That the avoided damages are roughly 150 times. So the benefits are roughly 150 times the cost in this case. This is really local pollution that we're talking about. We can do the same thing for greenhouse gas emissions. The climate benefits from reduced burning are about $69 per acre, again, higher than the cost of reducing burning. So in either case, this really kind of pays off in terms of benefits being greater than costs. And if you don't like the valuation steps that we have to do to get those benefit numbers, you can also just look at the kind of cost per life saved through this upfront payment for ecosystem services contract, and it's about $4,400 for kind of the statistical reduction in the mortality burden of crop residue burning. And so, relative to other interventions around the world, this is an extremely cost-effective way of saving lives. So this is all to say that, without that kind of A/B testing type of approach, we might have kind of missed the target here. So the standard PES approach that is used in a number of different contexts, that didn't really work in our case. And yet it's the most likely thing, if we hadn't done this type of piloting testing phase, that would have turned into policy. We might have concluded then that, like fines, like equipment subsidies, PES just doesn't work in this context. But what we could see through this kind of testing different approaches style of building up to scaling is that careful design can, in fact, make this PES approach work, be cost effective, and actually reduce burning. Now, of course, what I showed you, there needs to be some further innovation to go from this piloting through to policy scale. But we think there's a lot of scope because, unlike fines, which have to be implemented by the government, the payments can really come from anywhere and from anyone, providing there's some actor on the ground who can legitimately deliver them into the hands of farmers through an appropriate contract design. And in fact, that's a direction that we're working on as we speak. The other kind of meta lesson that I want to point out, given that this is a lecture on climate change, is that there's a greenhouse gas mitigation policy lesson in here as well, I think, which is that the emissions of many greenhouse gases are correlated with the emissions of many local pollutants. And so thinking about behavior and the sources of emissions in many low and middle income countries, that targeting the local pollutants where the local benefits of mitigation are very clear, where their development, where their health benefits of cleaning up the air in a lot of these countries can be a really important entry point to thinking about climate policy. There's often more political will. It helps align these sometimes potential conflicts between what is good for the global environment, climate, versus what is important for local development needs. So we see that very clearly in the crop residue burning case, but it's also true for industrial sources and many other things. Now, there are many other people working on testing different approaches for mitigation policy. I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about some of those, but in the meantime, let's move to an example that comes from adaptation, where this style of kind of testing is actually a little bit more scarce. So just like the climate finance flows being a bit less in adaptation, some of the testing of what actually works is also lagging a bit behind. This is a project in Niger that's conducted with Jenny Aker, and again, I've put the reference here if you want to check out the paper, since I'm doing a very quick, high-level overview of it. Niger, the country that we're studying, is among the poorest countries in the world. A large share of the population lives in a very small part of the land area. 85% of the population is dependent on agriculture as its main source of livelihood. And agriculture is becoming increasingly unpredictable with climate change. So floods and droughts are undermining sort of the dependability of these income flows. And at the same time, rapid soil quality degradation is really threatening people's ability to farm in many places where they have historically. Farmers are very poor in this setting. What that means is that the kind of capital inputs that they might want to invest to increase agricultural productivity, to reduce soil degradation, many of those are actually just unaffordable to farmers. And so we wanted to investigate an approach that agronomists have supported, which is rainwater harvesting techniques. So the idea here is that when the rain does fall, that these techniques can help capture that rainfall and allow it to infiltrate into the soils. Agronomic studies suggest that these types of approaches can help restore degraded land, increase yields, increase resilience to climate shocks. And yet across the Sahel, adoption levels remain low. The pictures that you can see on your screen are 3 different rainwater harvesting techniques. I'm going to talk to you about a project that tested adoption of what are called demi-lunes. That's the photo on your right. What these are is kind of half moon, as you can tell from the name, half moon shaped berms that farmers construct on the field that capture the rainwater when it falls and allow it to sink through the kind of hard pan that forms on top of degraded soils. So this is something that for farmers, potentially seems quite attractive, although like many adaptation technologies, a lot of the costs are borne upfront. So in the case of demi-lunes, this is mostly labor. This is one of the reasons that this is a potentially attractive technology for this setting, mostly labor investments, but these labor investments all happen at the beginning when you first adopt, whereas the benefits of that investment are spread out over time. This is sort of characteristic of a lot of climate adaptation, where the household or the individual has to incur some cost today in order to avoid climate damages in the future. Those climate damages, of course, are somewhat uncertain, right? It depends on whether some climate shock actually happens, whether there is a flood, whether there is a heat wave, whether there is a drought. For low-income households, this may appear relatively unattractive, given all of the immediate and much more certain needs that face them. So in the context of this trial, again, we wanted to take the approach of asking two questions. One, why, when we look around, are adoption levels low? And second, actually, maybe it's first, but second, conditional on adopting demi-lunes, do we actually see evidence that farmers' resilience is actually improving, that farmers are better off? So the way that we approach this is to say, well, let's think carefully about what are the different barriers that might hinder adoption of this technology. So could it be that farmers don't actually know about the technology or don't know actually how to adopt it? They don't know how to construct the demi-lunes, for example. Could it be that, a little bit like the crop residue burning case that I described to you, that the timing of costs and benefits are such that, when they actually need to make the investment, they don't have cash on hand. I just told you it's mostly labor costs, but maybe they need to hire some labor. Maybe they need to pull some family labor out of the market to construct the demi-lunes. Or could it just be that this time profile of upfront costs and long-run benefits just makes it unattractive because people have relatively high discount rates? They want more immediate payoffs. So we, again, designed a trial that would help us actually compare different approaches that were targeted to these different potential barriers, with the idea that if we could learn about what was precluding adoption, and perhaps more importantly, learn whether adoption actually helps farmers out, then that would be the input that we were working with the Ministry of Agriculture in Niger in this case. That would be the input they needed to figure out how to scale up effective policy in this space. Again, we used a randomized controlled trial relying on the randomized assignment of different villages to different treatments as a very clean way of testing what works and also being able to calculate cost effectiveness in this case. We did the interventions in year 1, and then we tracked outcomes for 3 years. The outcomes that we were interested in were adoption, but also whether crop revenue increased, how it affected labor allocation, whether soil quality improved, and whether we see other indications of climate resilience. So we're going to be comparing, in this case, a control group, business as usual, to a group that receives training only. This provides them with the information. And then a series of different cash transfer or cash incentive arms that layer on top of the training. So everybody who was in a treatment arm got training, plus some kind of a cash transfer intervention that, again, was designed to address these very particular barriers that I described to you before. What we found was a little bit surprising in some ways. The information alone resulted in very widespread adoption. So what you can see on the left side of the screen is that going from the control group, where adoption levels were about 4% of the control group had demi-lunes on their fields, to the training only intervention, we saw a 90 percentage point, meaning over 95% of farmers had demi-lunes on their field following the training. So they constructed demi-lunes. If you look at the different cash transfer arms, so these are sort of explain them to you, the unconditional cash transfer, a conditional cash transfer, and a different form of an unconditional cash transfer, we don't see any additional impact on adoption from those cash incentives. And part of that is, of course, is just because the training itself was so effective that there's really not that much room for adoption levels to go up past 95%. The other thing that we see on the right is if we pool these different treatment arms, we can look at whether adoption was in fact sustained. And if you look across the 3 years, this is the number of demi-loons that farmers had on their field, it is sustained. We don't see big increases in adoption following that first year, but nor do we see evidence of disadoption, which is sort of the first indication that these demi-loons were actually working for farmers. Now, looking at some of the other outcomes, given how high the take-up was, the adoption levels were, it's relatively easy to then just compare across the treatment arms and interpret at least some of these outcomes as coming directly from the demi-loons as opposed to, to other things. That's the beauty of the A/B testing, of the randomization. So what we see here on the left is a number of different soil quality indicators improving for these farmers. These are kind of first indications that resilience to climate shocks is really likely to improve. The more degraded the soil, the more vulnerable that piece of land is to changes in weather or climate. We also see fairly substantial increases in agricultural revenue, so 12 to 14% increase in crop income. And then finally, as the most direct measure of resilience, we see lower reported rates of crop failure following treatment. So again, farmers who were in one of the treatment arms who adopted demi-loons are less likely to be experiencing crop failures due to things like climate shocks. So this is all really good news, but again, a little bit like the crop residue burning case, without this initial evidence, without this kind of pilot phase of testing out these different treatments, we might have concluded something different. And so this is showing you a cost effectiveness graph. You can see the training on the left, training only, compared to some of these other arms that provided cash incentives as well. The black bars are the cost per demi-loon adopted. The gray bars are the cost per dollar of agricultural output. It turns out giving farmers cash in this setting actually does increase their agricultural output a little bit as well. So, the gray bars look a little bit different. But if we're really focused on some of the kind of long run changes in things like soil quality, the training is just clearly more cost effective in this case. And this kind of runs against some of the narrative in Niger, at least, that really without these kind of cash incentives, farmers will not adopt this technology. In this case, they do, and in this case, they actually pay off for the farmers, both in terms of the crop revenue that they're getting, but also in terms of this increased climate resilience. Now, I want to spend just a minute talking about kind of what we're doing to really follow this analogy through of generating evidence through careful testing and then taking that to policy. So we worked with the Ministry of Environment in this pilot phase that I just described to you. And we're working with them again now to follow up on that and to transition from this evidence phase of trying to figure out, okay, what type of intervention works, A, and to what degree? Is it cost effective? Is it actually increasing resilience? Is this actually something that the Ministry of Environment should be investing in? The pilot evidence is pretty clear. We see training alone has a big impact on adoption. It also has big impacts on things like crop revenue, crop failure, soil quality, and so on. So from the Ministry of Environment standpoint, that is evidence that they can act on. And yet when it comes to scale up, what you find in a lot of cases is going from the pilot phase of trying to generate evidence in the first place to the policy phase, things have to change, right? Going from a trial of around 3,000 farmers to something that's spread across, tens or hundreds of thousands of farmers in the country, it's a different animal. And so moving from the evidence generation to the policy requires changes to program design. Some of these are about just the feasibility of scaling, and some of these are about further saving costs. So in this case, we identified with the Ministry of Environment 3 main things that would need to change for them to be able to scale up trainings on demi-loons. First, they would need to do bigger trainings. They couldn't afford to have small trainings, multiple trainings per village. They would need to do big trainings. Second, they would not be able to send monitors out to count all the demi-loons and figure out what adoption rates were. They would need to monitor with remote sensing. But of course, from the farmer's perspective, maybe it's actually important to have somebody showing up at your field and checking on how you're doing. And then the third is they wanted to be able to train on multiple different rainwater harvesting techniques. Remember, I showed you that slide that had a few different options. We did this pilot generation, evidence generation with one of them. The ministry wants to be able to train on multiple. We are concerned that some of these changes might actually undermine some of the effectiveness of what we found in the original kind of evidence generation or pilot phase. And so what we're doing is we're working with the ministry as they scale up to try to generate some evidence on how do the impacts of training change as, for example, you go from a small training to a large training, with the idea that if it really is so beneficial to have these small trainings, maybe that's actually something that they want to find a way to take forward and turn into their policy, even if it's not kind of how they would typically otherwise do it. So I think this intermediate step, I wanted to have a slide on it and spend a little bit of time on it, because I think it's an important bridge. If policymakers and practitioners are willing to go to the trouble of generating evidence at the beginning, then trying to find ways to ensure that that evidence generalizes to the policy case is extremely important. Sometimes it'll be relatively seamless, but for other things, like the example on this slide, various things have to change, and just making sure that those are not things that mean that the initial pilot evidence doesn't actually scale is I would argue, a pretty crucial step. Now, I promised you at the beginning that that I am not the only person trying to do this. In fact, you probably know many of them, and maybe some of you are listening in on this. So there's a growing number of researchers, both in academia and outside of academia, that are collaborating with policymakers, NGOs, other practitioners to try to do this kind of rigorous testing on what works and how to make climate interventions more cost effective before they go to scale. And so this is just one way of trying to see the growth in this kind of movement. This is new randomized controlled trials registered on the American Economic Association's trial registry. This is going to be heavily biased toward trials that have academic researchers partnering on them. But there are many, many more. So the World Bank has an evaluation unit. A number of other different agencies have evaluation units. They're big consulting organizations that have started really trying to do this, suggesting that there is demand for this and suggesting that it can be feasibly implemented in the early stages of policy design. And so let me kind of start to wrap up here with a little bit of discussion on some of the pushback that that I and others sometimes get on the argument that we really need this evidence to try to figure out what works in climate adaptation and mitigation. So the argument goes something like, well, the need is urgent. This evidence generation, like it's great, it's interesting, but it takes time and money, and that's time and money that we really don't have. So one answer is, well, it doesn't take that much time and money once you start thinking about direct collaborations with policymakers and practitioners, and perhaps it actually speeds up the scaling process because you can more directly figure out what's actually working. New and innovative data sources, things like remote sensing, administrative data, expands the coverage and shortens the turnaround time for these types of policy evidence generation. And there are a variety of methods. Not everything has to be kind of the pure randomized A/B test and so on. Retrospective evaluations that look at what has worked in the past to help inform new policy design and new policy implementation, can equally work. And then finally, I think the strongest counter argument, of course, is just that, well, not generating the evidence risks wasting far more time and money on projects that are actually not having an impact and that end up being very expensive because all of the project budget is going to a very, very, very small change in whatever the desired outcome is. And I would argue in the climate space, this is a particularly relevant concern, given what I showed you at the beginning about the very limited climate financing that is flowing into these areas. So I think I'm leaving us with a decent amount of time for questions and discussion. I've put a couple of links up on these slides, which I assume are going to be posted if you want to learn a little bit more about either the cases that I've presented or more generally other projects that are doing this style of work. And Anna mentioned some at the beginning from other SSRC events as well, if you're interested. So let me wrap up there and turn it over to discussion and Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kelsey. Super interesting. I'm going to start. We have a bunch of questions here, and I'm going to start with some questions about the crop burning project, and then some questions about the dummy loons, and then zoom out to some big picture questions. So we have some questions here about the contracts in the crop burning case, and I think people are trying to understand the rates of compliance. So one question here is, what was the farmer's liability for not complying, for engaging in the contract and not complying? Was there any liability at all in the case where there was an upfront payment, and then they don't comply?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And it's actually relevant for all of the contract designs. And I think it's actually relevant for a lot of kind of voluntary environmental actions. So one of the things about the incentive-based approach, as opposed to something like the carrot versus the stick, right? The incentive-based approach is voluntary by design. So if a farmer says, I will participate in your program, and chooses to not comply, there's really nothing that happens, right? So there's very little penalty. And I didn't show you the take-up numbers, but the take-up numbers are relatively high. Over 70% of farmers who are offered the contract take it up. Far fewer end up complying with it. And that's very rational, right? If you think there's any chance that you're going to not want to burn your field for whatever reason, it's better to be in the contract and maybe get paid if there's really no penalty associated with non-compliance. This is true for these payments for ecosystem services contracts really around the world. There are a few exceptions where there is some penalty for not actually complying, but the large share of them, it's voluntary. So take up, wait and see what happens, and comply if you want to. And I think, in many ways, that's part of what makes them more politically feasible in a lot of kind of lower income settings, is that you're not requiring, it's sort of voluntary behavior change. You're creating an incentive. You're making that behavior change cheaper for the participant or the recipient, but you're not mandating it. You're not requiring, you're not forcing it. And so, that indeed is one of the challenges, is that if there are administrative costs, for example, of enrolling farmers in the program, then a little bit like the upfront payments, you pay that cost for everybody, even if many of them end up deciding to not comply. So it's a design feature that is true for for voluntary programs kind of everywhere.
One of the things you didn't really talk about was what were the alternative technologies that farmers were using to the few of them that are doing something other than crop burning, and are those, is it that are you paying them enough? So what are they doing, and what are the costs of those alternatives?
Great. No, and that's a good question. So I think two things in there. The first is, what did we actually see in the project in terms of what did farmers do instead? So I mentioned in the slides, the Indian government has quite heavily subsidized particular pieces of equipment. So happy seeder is probably the most famous one, as an alternative to burning. We measured what farmers did instead of burning, and virtually no one switched to using a happy seeder, which is interesting because that has been a major source of public expenditure. And I think it's like exactly exemplifying my meta point of we need to know if these expenditures are working, because it has been a very big government outlay. So virtually nobody switched into that. What most farmers did who chose not to burn was use a baler. So this is like a long standing technology that bales up the straw. And for the most part, what those bales are being used for is actually as an industrial heat source. So they're being transported and used in lieu of fossil fuels so you can think of this as like a biofuel type of an alternative. So that was the main thing that we documented. The second question is, are the modest, I would say, compliance rates that we see just because the payment levels were too low. And the reason that we chose those payment levels was through discussion with the government of what levels of payments would be potentially scalable. we didn't want to go test something that would just never be able to inform policy, never turn into policy. And indeed, so if you were paying a lot of attention and reading the fine point, what you noticed is that the default contract, like the base contract, paid 800 rupee per acre for these farmers. And in fact, the government of Haryana, this study took place in Punjab, a state in Haryana, which is a neighboring state, which has a lot of burning as well. They've actually started offering payments for ecosystem services, conditional payments to farmers at 1,000 rupee per acre. So, so I think this sort of validates that this is in fact the right ballpark level of payment. But I would completely agree with you that it is too low. What's interesting though is what we I didn't get into like all of our results, but the other thing that we can do is we have a treatment arm that pays people more. So we have a treatment arm that pays farmers twice as much. So the base contract is 800 rupee. We have a treatment arm that pays 1,600 rupee. Going from 800 to 1,600 when it is all paid conditional on compliance has less of an effect than paying 25% of that 800 upfront. So you can get more of an impact by modifying features of the contract than you can by just increasing the contract level or the payment level without also taking some of these design features into consideration. And so I think that's kind of the bigger takeaway, is just cranking up the amount is not necessarily going to do it unless you also consider some of the barriers that are somewhat, more context specific that really do require this kind of evidence generation. I think without testing, it's very hard to foresee what may work here.
Here's a question about, again, about crop burning, and the cost benefit analysis is really compelling, particularly for mortality, of course, right? It's like clear that even though there's a relatively small increase in compliance, we should still be doing it. The question is about the kind of the optics and the politics of the findings, about just given the large amount of non-compliance, whether policymakers in India have found the results sufficiently compelling to increase adoption. So the question is really about what has been the follow-on response from policymakers.
Yeah, that's great, and it's a great question. I think it highlights some of the challenges. So. Sort of the two positive things are, as I mentioned, we were designing this in pretty close collaboration with the government of Punjab at the time, and so they provided a lot of input into what potentially could be scalable. Since the program wrapped up, the government of Haryana, which is not where the study took place, but they have scaled up a quite related approach. The politics between Punjab, where a lot of the burning is happening, and the central government, where a lot of the damage is. So I had the little slide showing, burning in Punjab affects air quality in Delhi. And that's really because of the prevailing winds at the time of the year when most of the burning is happening. It's actually moving the smoke from the agricultural areas over the population centers, which is a particularly problematic thing given the public goods nature of air pollution. And the challenge there is there's this kind of jurisdictional externality where the central government would very much like Punjab to do a better job cracking down on things. And in fact, if you follow the news on this, there are periodic threats by the central government to, completely cut off the state government's budget. More recently, there have been some changes in governance through elections. And so it's a little bit of a moving space. I think the direction that I mentioned, we're doing some ongoing work to think about scale up. And I think one direction that we find really exciting about this incentive-based approach is it doesn't necessarily have to be the government. So if we're concerned that politics are going to be constantly changing and interfering, fines really have to be the government, right? Like you really can't substitute for the police through non-state actors. Whereas the incentives, there's nothing that says that, some person in Delhi or some consortium of people in Delhi can't say, well, we would be quite happy to make transfers to farmers in Punjab so that they reduce their burning. And so I think if you could think about like aggregating that demand for better air quality, which is actually in some ways easier probably than aggregating the demand for fewer greenhouse gas emissions. If you could aggregate some of that demand for better air quality, that you could think about actually scaling up this type of an approach in ways that don't necessarily depend quite as much on the government. And that's exactly the direction that we're, given some of these political hurdles that we've run into with scaling up, this is exactly the direction that we're hoping to move in next.
So this is one of my big picture questions, which is sparked by listening to something you just said. At the very beginning of your talk, you said quite rightly that I think that we need much more evaluation of what works and what doesn't. And, that just seems so obviously right. And you just said you worked with the government of Punjab, right, on the crop burning project, and you worked with, the government of Niger on the demi-lunes project. So those are both great success stories of working with government agencies to do the kind of A/B testing, trials that we need more of. I have been really become a real consumer of the research literature on the uptake of evidence by policymakers. So the people who are running the trials on, we have these findings, now we want policymakers to adopt them. What are the things that we can do to get policymakers to adopt our findings? But what I haven't seen is, like, on the front end, how do we get policymakers to work with us to form these research partnerships? Because it seems like such an uphill battle. And so I'm curious whether, based on your own experiences, what has worked, what advice do you have to offer to other researchers who want to do more of this kind of, partnership-based research?
Yeah, it's a great question. And very unfortunately in Niger, the recent coup has also actually introduced a major kind of political hurdle to a scale-up project that's actually well underway. So I do think one of the challenges with the government partnerships are politics, in various forms. And so, so in some ways these are success stories, but in some ways I think they're also cautionary to a degree of, I would like to think that the evidence that we've generated informs actors other than the particular partners who we've generated the evidence with. I would say that the shortcut to influencing policy and to scaling is actually to do exactly what we've tried to do in both of these projects by working closely with governments and working closely with actors who have the capacity to scale up, but also recognize that it's important to be thinking exactly about this kind of generalizability question at the evidence generation stage, because stuff happens. There are elections, there are coups, I guess calling this a coup is a loaded thing. I probably should say the government takeover in Niger. But in any case, the point is, like, stuff happens. And even the best intentioned partner with full plans to take things forward, things may come up that mean that they don't. And so I think our responsibility in some ways is to be trying to anticipate that to some degree and think about how to create somewhat general evidence such that if it doesn't work out, for example, in Niger to take this forward, that we can go to another country and potentially try to work with policymakers there to take that evidence forward. We always have to be very careful. Contexts are different. Things don't necessarily scale. And so it may be that another kind of round of A/B testing is necessary to figure out exactly what approach makes the most sense in that particular context. But I really think that the partnership on the pilot stage, the partnership on the evidence generation stage, is the most effective thing that I have seen turning into follow-up. It's not always a direct path. Sometimes that means it's a bit of a winding road, but at least it puts you in the position that you've taken some of the kind of real world constraints on board in designing that initial evaluation, which I think is really key.
Have you thought about what kinds of strategies, whether it's funding agencies, I don't know whether it's USAID or it's multilaterals, like the World Bank, can use to work with their partner and client countries to encourage more partnerships with researchers like yourself to do this kind of testing? I'm not a development economist, so I get the sense that there's some of this, but do we need more?
Well, so I would argue, Anna, that In development economics, this has actually come a long way. So several international, bilateral agencies and multilateral agencies do require some impact evaluation, not necessarily requiring a randomized controlled trial, but some impact evaluation. I think what they don't often require is this more, I think why I picked these two case studies is in part because they both have this flavor of, let's try to experiment a little on the design of what we're doing to try to see if there are more cost-effective or more effective ways to do it. And I think that is crucially important, because I think often if we just say, well, this is what, I read some other place did, and don't really do this phase of, well, let's try to innovate a little bit. Let's see if we can lower the cost through some tweaks on design. So I think that is missing to a large degree. And then the other thing that I think is really missing is doing this in the climate space. So with the adaptation funding, some of that flows through development aid, but some of that flows through more, adaptation financing aid. And I don't think the same sort of taste for evidence has jumped from international development to international climate finance really at all. And so and there's no reason it shouldn't. Adaptation, it can be hard to see all the tails of the climate distribution and so on, and really understand exactly how effective this thing is going to be. But that shouldn't prevent us from trying to learn from the money that is being spent. So I think that development has progressed further than climate finance has, one. And then two, I think the opportunities to innovate at early stages of policy and program implementation, I think that is being missed in a lot of cases. But certainly a lot of this is, where this is happening, it is donor driven. And so I think it just needs to shift into the climate realm, and a similar kind of model can really start to take off.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever encounter the criticism? You also started your talk with telling us, showing us the thing we already know, but it's good to have a reminder every now and then that, emissions are really primarily being generated by high-income countries. And do you ever get any response to your talks, particularly on the mitigation work that you do? Maybe you should be studying what we in high-income countries could be doing to reduce our emissions as opposed to low-income countries.
Yeah, definitely. And that's exactly actually why I highlighted the kind of local pollutant, global pollutant correlation. Yeah. I think that is crucially important. I think if people like us go talk to policymakers in India and lead with the point that we would like you to, not increase your per capita emissions to the levels that ours are at, that's kind of a non-starter for the conversation. If instead many parts of India are truly facing a local air pollution crisis, and we go in and think about collaborating on policy innovations to deal with that. And if, hey, by the way, at the same time, there's this benefit of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, leapfrogging to cleaner technologies, and so on, I think that's kind of a win all around. And so certainly when we think about mitigation, I would argue that the big opportunities in low and middle income countries are avoiding the kind of technology lock-in into dirty, high carbon intensity things. So it's probably a bit less in agriculture. I think agriculture is a nice place where you get this local externality, global externality alignment. But I think more broadly, the places where emissions are not yet high, the biggest benefits are going to be from investment that simultaneously promotes growth, but in ways that are not locking people into depending on coal-fired power plants for the next 20 years.
Yeah. So we have a ton of questions here, which I'm not going to be able to get to, but maybe one last question about design, because you mentioned the importance of innovating intervention designs. And here's a question about, have you thought about the various merits of paying or somehow rewarding farmers for adopting particular mitigation or adaptation enhancing strategies versus getting higher food prices for meeting some kind of standard? Have you thought about which of those designs might be more effective?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think both can be effective. I think they're both effectively carrots, right? They're both ways of rewarding people for adopting practices that have fewer bad elements, more good elements. And I think that to the extent that the market can kind of bake in some of those incentives for organic, for whatever the produce is, or the product is, if there's truly a premium that people are willing to pay for that, that's excellent. I think there's been some work to try to figure out where, if it's just going through the market, how much of that actually gets back to the farmer. And I think the evidence there is pretty mixed. In a lot of cases, it goes to sort of people along the supply chain, and not as much of it actually ends up going into the hands of the farmer. So that's just, one potential caution for relying on the market to kind of reward good practices. But, in some ways, whether you're tying the incentive to a particular output or to a particular behavior change, or in some ways, ideally, to changes in emissions, which is sort of the most direct thing that we might want to reward, I think the general kind of economic theory of it, and I haven't seen as much like really clear evidence on this, would be the more we can tie that incentive to the actual thing that is socially desirable, the more efficient it will be. And so, if the output, if the agricultural output is closer, great. If the practice is closer, great. And so that's some of the trade-off, I think.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. All right, we could keep going for probably another hour at least. We'll make sure that we send you all of the questions that we got that we didn't have a chance to get to. And for everybody who tuned in today, thank you for coming. We'll make sure to post a recording as soon as we can get it up online. And thank you to everybody, and thank you especially to Kelsey for joining us today and sharing your work with us.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the opportunity. Take care.
All right, take care, everybody. Have a good weekend.